We're going to do something really awesome with somebody in May. So come on out.
It's really compelling, right?
Performance and photography opening night, they all come out. It's like personal. Where?
Yes.
I'm so glad you know.
Looks like I was It's in their neighbor, the pulmonary neighbor.
It's been made for a long time. At first we wanted to put a pulmonary neighbor. Like, no, not that woman. He's come along. He's really come along. And that was in 2007. But then it got to be very heavy. And he got over that.
And just thank you. Everyone.
Could lead us with a song to start off?
Yeah. For Robin, you say English words. Yeah, just it was really sweet. What a good idea.
Right there with you. Yes.
Getting it all in place.
Yeah, every platform.
That sort of blocks the view.
Thanks for a long time.
I'm going right after you.
Yeah, great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third of our special series on dangerous memories. My name is Barbara Lau. I'm the director of the Pauli Murray Project, which is part of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, and we are really in for a special treat. I am so pleased that my friend Jennifer Scott is here. We want to thank the University Archives, Bass Connections, and the LAMP Project for their help supporting this series. It's been a really important set of voices to bring to campus in talking about how we think about the places that we are, and the memories that we see and the memories that we don't see, and our responsibilities to some of those memories. Jennifer Scott is the director of the Jane Addams Hull House in Chicago. She and I met through the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, of which we are both members, a group of museums and historic sites around the world that use dialogue to connect history to contemporary issues. She is an anthropologist and a public historian who's worked in museums, arts and history organizations for more than 25 years. For a very long time, she was in New York City. They had to kind of pry her out of there to move her to Illinois, but she worked at the Weeksville Heritage Center, which is a really important 19th century site about African American history, landowning, community building, enterprise. It's in Brooklyn. We certainly encourage you, if you're in New York, to visit. As the Hull House director, she leads the museum in their visioning, in their curation, and in their community engagement. It's a nationally significant historic site dedicated to contemporary social justice issues. One of the reasons we're so happy Jennifer is here is because her work is so connected to the work we're trying to do at the Pauli Murray Center. She recently launched 2 National Endowment for the Humanities funded initiatives in Chicago, Making the West Side, Community Conversations on Neighborhood Change, and Securing the Common Good. She serves as faculty in the graduate program of Museum and Exhibition Studies at the University of Illinois Chicago, and since 2003 has served as a professor at the New School for Public Engagement in New York, where she teaches courses in cultural anthropology, arts and social engagement, race, ethnic studies, and museology. She researches and writes and travels all over the world talking about this work, encouraging people to do this work, and she's a prolific writer. She is one of the facilitators and editors for a working group, Museums and Civic Discourse, Past, Present, and Emerging Futures. Excuse me. She holds degrees from Stanford University, the University of California, Los Angeles, and the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. We are welcoming her to Duke today.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute for inviting me here to share my work, especially Barbara Lau, who is a kindred spirit, a very supportive colleague and friend. And Barbara took me to a talk yesterday here at Duke with Dr. Monica Coleman, who is a professor of theology, and talking about dangerous theology, which was speaking to us. And she talked a lot about how you lose so much in this work, and you can expect to lose a lot. And it's sort of the risk of doing this work, which I'll talk more about, because it's really challenging. You're taking risk. And so it's really important to have kindred spirits through this. And so Barbara, thank you so much for being one of those people in my life, professionally and personally. So I work a lot with hidden histories and what people call erased histories that are often denigrated, which is why they're usually ignored or made invisible, because they're not valued as much. And lately, I've been working with historic house museums, as Barbara mentioned, Weeksville in Brooklyn, that represent socially marginalized communities and these neglected histories. And I help to mine these histories as a way to help re-envision these sites as places of social change. So these museums have been called unconventional, even radical, because we use these histories of activism, social reform, movement building to address present-day social justice issues through our research programming, exhibitions, and oral history. So when you think of historic house museums, you probably don't think of radical change. Usually they're associated with preservation, which is sort of, keeping the past and stewarding the past and keeping things the same, or with elite histories, as Monica was saying yesterday, they usually tell the stories of white, male, straight, land-owning gentry. She said German. Land-owning gentry. You don't think of them as places of the people. But one of the things I really like about historic houses, which, beyond their quirkiness, is something that I think all museums, even art museums and cultural sites, can learn from. And that's that they do the local very well. And they really take into account, consider local history and what's been called small histories, but not of lesser value. They really think about that and how it connects to larger stories. So I'm going to talk today about the ways in which we use history at my current site, Hull House Museum, to engage the present, to tap into social justice issues, to support community engagement processes, and subvert normative narratives, and in particular to bring in the many who are left out of mainstream discussions and mainstream institutions. There's a lot of exclusion. And hopefully inspire you to think about new ways of engagement in social justice at historic and cultural sites. So I am currently, as Barbara mentioned, at the Jane Addams Hull House Museum in Chicago, which you see here. It's part of the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I also teach in the graduate program Museum and Exhibition Studies. And what you see here is one of 2 remaining historic buildings from what was originally a 13-building settlement. So I will talk more about what happened to it. It's connected to our relationship to the University of Illinois. What you can't see in this picture is right to the left is our second historic building, which is a historic dining hall, where we do a lot of our programming, and we use it in many ways in the same way that it was used over 130 years ago, as a gathering space, as a place to debate issues, programming lectures, etc. And it's every time someone speaks in there, we mention, or they mention, who passed through. A lot of notables passed through and spoke there and knew to come to that place to have these debates and conversations. So Ida B. Wells Barnett, W.B. Du Bois, Gertrude Stein, Eleanor Roosevelt, the list goes on and on. It's pretty incredible, the long history. So it's a big legacy that we've inherited to think about and interpret in the present. This picture gives you an idea of what the 13-building settlement would have looked like at the time. That's Halsted Street, which we were facing. It was an entire campus that went on for a few blocks. So the museum serves as a tribute to the legacy of international feminist and peace activists, whom I'm sure you've all heard of, Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, and other progressive era social reformers and radicals who founded Hull House in 1889 on the west side of Chicago, working with immigrants who were struggling with poverty, racism, gender oppression, unregulated labor. The factories were all nearby. And terrible housing conditions. It was a woman-centered space that fought to break down class, race, and gender barriers. And it was modeled after something that Jane and Ellen had seen on a visit to London called Toynbee Hall in London's East End, which was actually a men's workhouse that was created by Oxford students, and I think Cambridge students as well, to support laborers. So they liked this model, and they wanted to try it out in the States, which is what they did. So at the turn of the 20th century, middle-class settlement workers like Addams moved into working-class neighborhoods and grappled with the modern industrialized city alongside their neighbors. Settlement houses made social change through cultural programming, and this is important because we think about this all the time in terms of our own interpretation. Cultural programming, policy reform and advocacy, and direct service. They built multi-building settlement in what was considered one of the worst urban slums at the time, and through the settlement, they blurred the lines of the domestic and civic spheres, opening their living quarters to the public, hosting countless activities, art activities, theater activities, classes, cultural productions. They encouraged cooperative living, democratic exchanges, and a holistic life. And it was really a visionary sort of experiment that we think a lot about in terms of our own present-day interpretation. Which gave way to the birth of the idea of social welfare. Hull House was a 75-year project to combat poverty, disease, ignorance, and injustice in Chicago's most diverse immigrant neighborhood through immersion. So they literally moved to the west side and opened their doors. Some of the pioneering programs that developed as the settlement developed included a kindergarten, daycare facilities for children of working mothers, an employment bureau, a public kitchen, a health clinic, a library, an art gallery. In fact, the first building after the main house that was built in the settlement in 1891 was a public art gallery, Chicago's first art gallery. So you had people working 16 hours a day in these factories, and they felt that art and culture should help to balance and give a more holistic life and to be some relief from labor. So it's interesting that a settlement house creates an art gallery as their first project. Library and art gallery, a theater, music and art classes. Hull House played a significant role in the founding of the nation's first juvenile court. So before this, they were trying children as adults. Supported new legislation to support workers' rights, conducted sociological studies on neighborhood public health conditions, and advocated for housing regulation and reform, public education, and women's rights. It was called a Cathedral of Humanity, and a bold experiment in democracy built to rethink how a society must care for its people. And I love this quote from Jane Addams, which I think sounds very sort of Martin Luther King Jr.-esque. "The good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secured for all of us and incorporated into our common life." So today, questions around the common good have again risen to the level of national debate in the U.S. as states throughout the nation struggle with insolvency and public services are forced to redefine themselves in their financial structures or face impending demise. The depletion of funding for public services demonstrates that much has changed since Adams founded the settlement. And if we're to adequately address today's monumental questions of democracy, social and fiscal responsibility, the all things public, which is being constantly derided, and the social contract, we must first grapple with Jane Addams' America and the origins of the modern welfare state. So a big legacy that we're trying to interpret in the present. There's an infinite number of directions we can go in. Today, the museum connects the past to the present by re-engaging the idea of the common good and connecting the past to contemporary social justice issues, which there are many. And we focus all of our exhibitions, programs, and education initiatives on issues such as juvenile justice, immigration, sexuality, labor, gender, youth, and education. So I'm not going to go into our permanent exhibition. Can you see that? It's maybe, okay. But I wanted to pull this piece out. We have our permanent exhibition that's kind of your traditional history exhibition with artifacts. Not sure what's happening. Oh, my computer. Okay, we're back. That's going to happen again and again. I wanted to give you a sense of that history exhibition. What I'm going to talk about today are some of our other contemporary programming, but I feel like this piece of the museum drives so much of what we do. So as many of you know, Jane Addams was the first American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931 for her international peace activism and her opposition to World War I. At the same time, the FBI began keeping a file on Addams in the 1920s. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI from 1924 to 1972, considered her subversive because of her peace activism, and her ties in organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So in the museum, we actually put the replica of her Nobel Peace Prize next to her FBI file. And it drives questions for us as to why, at this time, was Jane Addams considered the most dangerous woman in America, which she was. And then who is considered dangerous today? Why are women considered dangerous? Why are peace activists considered dangerous? What are considered dangerous issues and why? Dangerous for whom? And who is criminalized today? Who is shut out of society? Who are the most vulnerable populations today? And you know, in Jane Addams' settlement time, it was mostly Eastern and Southern European immigrants. The neighbors have changed, issues have changed, needs have changed. And so we look at contemporary equivalents to what the settlement workers were doing and the reformers and the radicals. But I feel like this sort of captures it for us. So what I'm going to talk about now is I pulled out 3 examples so you can sort of get how we're tying history to the present in sort of these, non-traditional ways. 2 are exhibitions. As I said, we have a permanent history exhibition, but we also have dedicated space on our second floor to contemporary art. So again, it's sort of, in a way, this is our radical approach to connect contemporary art with artifacts and history. And it's a way that we've been learning is a really effective way to think about contemporary issues and to push the envelope and to challenge people. You're seeing it a little bit more in historic houses, not as much as I would like to, but we have been experimenting quite a bit, and it's proved to be pretty well received. It's not what you would necessarily expect in a historic house museum. So this was when I first went to Hull House a little over 2 years ago. This was our first exhibition, Into Body, Into Wall. Into Body, Into Wall. And this is an exhibition that was a collaboration with a collective called 96 Acres Project, featuring the artist Maria Gaspar. And it addresses one of the most excluded populations in the U.S. when we talk about who are the most vulnerable, who are the most criminalized, the incarcerated. So the 96 Acres Project is a series of community-engaged, site-responsive art projects that involve community stakeholders' ideas about social and restorative justice issues and examine the impact of incarceration at the Cook County Jail on Chicago's West Side. We're on the West Side, so we're reconnecting with our West Side. The Cook County Jail, I learned, being an outsider coming from New York to Chicago, is, if not the largest, it's one of the largest jails in the country. And it is, or the largest jail in a neighborhood in the country. So people are growing up with this jail. It's literally 96 acres, which I was told is the equivalent of 77 football fields. Incredibly large, incredibly impactful when you think of, institutions. So we launched this exhibit in conjunction with Jane Addams' birthday in September, where we host conversations on peace and justice, and we honored prison abolitionist Mariam Kaba, who gave a lecture on, again, within the vulnerable community of the incarcerated, one of the most vulnerable communities that's not even being talked about, which is girls in juvenile justice. She did an incredible talk on punishing girls, the rise of girls in the juvenile justice system. The title of the exhibit, Into Body, Into Wall, emerges from Palestinian-American writer Suhair Hamad's poem, Break Vista, which contemplates the ways in which walls are structures of oppression around the world. And this predates the presidential campaign. But when we think about how we want to engage contemporary issues, there was enough talk about walls even then for us to make the focus of this exhibition on walls and structures. So if you can imagine that Trump. So it contemplates the wall, thinking about architectures of power incarceration and the largest jail, as I said, on the west side, and all of the social, political, psychological, physical barriers that we face, on a daily basis. We wanted to help people imagine and reflect on new alternatives, grapple with personal stories from both sides of the wall, and raise questions about what it means to be this kind of an institution in a neighborhood, and how to be good neighbors, with this sort of thing right there in the shadows. A portion of the wall, the actual jail wall, it's not a prison, was actually printed by Maria Gaspar, 96 Acres, on the drape, which was on this very complicated movable tract, and we could move the curtain. It's suggesting these ideas of permeability, and create programming spaces and put chairs. But there were also little stations throughout here you can't see where people, you could hear voices and audio of people who were directly impacted by the jail and the experiences, are either families or detainees or former detainees. And you could also sit down and give your own feedback and self-expression through a kind of rotary phone, actually, and leave comments. There was also a projector where you could draw and imagine alternatives to this kind of a wall. There's some. You can see the video. We also had video of a lot of the 96 Acre projects, art projects. Some of them are really incredible and impactful. We didn't have a lot of text, and we also did a lot of public programming and worked with several artists, thinking about not just victimization of the wall, but creative resistance workshops is what we called them. And to give you, it was a way for local community members, artists, scholars, activists, and residents to use art making and collaborative processes and praxis, both action and reflection, to produce this set of workshops to help envision building spaces of transformation. And so some of the workshops, just to give you the titles so you can get a sense, because I know you think Historic House Museum, creative resistance workshops, body scanning, mapping spaces of healing, memory, and collective reflection, infrastructures of control, space design, and mechanisms of power, surveying the surveyor, optics of control, making visible, interrogating criminalization, policing, and creating interventions. So, Whole House, we don't do anything light. We're very into buttons, and T-shirts. So again, it's just other mediums of the conversation that we're constantly having about these issues. It can happen in all sorts of places. We know we're dealing with heavy subjects all the time, so we try to be as lighthearted as possible. This is an image from the opening, which was standing room only. That's Maria Gaspar in the front row on the left. And the three young women sitting next to her are part of the Young Chicago Authors, who are these phenomenal poets in Chicago. And these particular young women were doing amazing poetry. related to experiences of jail and incarceration and gender, which was fantastic. So this year, we are focusing on a whole different exhibition that's in conjunction with what we anticipated was going to be a very contested election, and which proved true. And we wanted to figure out a way to create interventions for people to have conversations, to help with the frustration, to give people outlets, to build new communities. So we worked with a wonderful artist who's actually a textile artist named Aram Han Cifuentes. She created something called the Official Unofficial Voting Station, voting for all who legally can't. And I put a lot of materials in the back that you're welcome to take away. As a resident and non-citizen of the United States who is barred from voting, South Korean artist Aram Han Cifuentes' Official Unofficial Voting Station inserts an unsanctioned voting process into the presidential election season from last year. Aligned with the museum and the history of the early social reformers of Hull House, Cifuentes' project explores urgent questions about participation, exclusion, and citizenship in the United States, targeting all those who are shut out of voting rights and democratic participation. Again, some of America's most vulnerable residents, including the millions of undocumented, incarcerated, youth under 18, non-citizen immigrants, residents of U.S. territories, the homeless, and the list goes on and on. She collaborated, it didn't start off this way, but it got more and more popular, so we ended up collaborating with several other artists across the country in about 10 cities who wanted their portable, unofficial voting stations. And also 2 cities in Mexico. So Chiapas and Mexico City. We worked a lot with our graphic designer, acknowledging that some of the barriers are also literacy as well. So everything was in pictograms in terms of instructions and how to vote. We had multiple languages, and we created and designed ballots, which I'll tell you more about, and then shipped them out to all these cities with ballot boxes. And in the end, they shipped them back to us, and we had counting sessions and things like that. The ballots, which some of you probably saw in the back, they all folded once you finished, and here's the ballots, into these beautiful graphic things. And in the back they said, I voted and I counted. And after we cataloged them and counted them, they would actually become part of the art installation, hanging from the ceiling like flyers. So Hull House, let me show you some. So this is some of the wall text that you can see. You can see the graphics. Hull House was hosting what essentially was the main hub voting station called Vox Pop the Disco Party. So it was a voting station with a disco theme, designed as a collaboration between, I have to show you, of course, Jane Addams is in all the fun. It was her birthday celebration when we launched these exhibitions, so we have these birthday cupcakes all the time. So we had Vox Pop Disco birthday cupcakes. And here is a kind of snapshot of what it looked like. We have like strobe lights and everything. So the Vox Pop the Disco Party is a collaboration between Cifuentes and Lise Haller-Bagason, who's she's from Denmark and also a non-citizen. And in their own words, this is what they wanted. They wanted something celebratory, but also that would communicate protest. So Vox Pop is a party, a celebration, and a refuge for all who are disenfranchised. Vox Pop is a protest in celebration of ourselves and our voices. Vox Pop stands for the voice of the people. Vox Pop is where the discounted count. Vox Pop is allowed to be an American. And one of the main questions that they were asking, we were asking, is how does one have a say when voting is not an option? How can one secure representation? So Cifuentes and Bagason created a little manifesto, kind of to work out their thinking around this. And I just want to read an excerpt from it. Being non-citizens, we find ourselves unable to vote in this election, although many issues in the ongoing presidential debate pertain directly to our own situation, as well as to the lives of our loved ones around the world. Being citizens of the world, we find ourselves unwilling to sit idly by. In the current political climate, there is too much at stake to simply bite your tongue. So the exhibition is a strong statement on not being heard and on making oneself heard. She's a fiber and textile artist, so of course there's batiks. They're hand-tied batik fabrics that play on the iconic Americana red, white, and blue, a protest music playlist that runs nonstop in the installation. Soundscapes for the project were provided by the third collaborator artist, DJ Sadie Rock, who's there. A silver disco ball, protest banners in pinks and purples. They flaunt sayings and rallying calls such as vote it but not count it, speak up to get down. And the exhibition intention was to acclaim loudness and flamboyance without any apology for those who are usually invisible or silenced or at the margins. The exhibition was also intended to capture the rampant rage, outrage, confusion, frustrations, and anxieties of feelings and of lack of choice and powerlessness that many were feeling during the presidential election. And maybe some of you in the room can relate to this. DJ Sadie Rock was at our opening. Also, we had November 8th Election Day activities, and so we always had a lot of music. Again, we try to make it as fun as possible while people are dealing with all of these issues. So during the opening, we also created something called Vox Pop Tic-Tac-Toe. I put some samples out there where you could, if you got 3 in a row with these stickers that we are on those cards, you'd get a little prize from Hull House. But they say things like, I'm a child of immigrants. I know someone who has decided not to become an American citizen. I still believe in democracy. And it's just another way, again, to have a conversation or to interact with some of these issues. So this is our ballot. I can tell you more of how we decided. Of course, none of these things are straightforward. You know, should we do local elections? Should we do national elections? So we decided on presidential elections. You could do a write-in. And then at the top of the ballot in multiple languages, this became a very important part of the project. Again, it wasn't our initial statement, but we had people fill in the sentence, I'm voting here because. So we imagined a lot of people who could not vote would vote here, but also people who are eligible could vote here. And what we saw was that it was a combination of both, but we were able to find out why. And some of these answers were so incredibly moving and profound, which I'll share with you in a bit. We had 2 voting stations. These are one of they. And what we would do is go into one. You can see the silver metallic disco theme inside the drape. You could close it or not close it. So you sort of have that feeling of the official stations. You would vote, fill in, and then you fold it, and then you place it in the ballot boxes. And we collected quite a few votes this way, which also surprised us. And then every Tuesday up to November 8th, we would have counting days. And the counting days were done by volunteers, whoever would show up, also very non-traditional. They involved the ballots, a voting box, and a megaphone. So on the second floor of the Historic House Museum, we would open the window, and people would read out other people's words, I'm voting here because, and they would yell it down to the street. So here you can see some of I think these are my graduate students that I pulled into this project. And the process helping to catalog. And they, in this case, they didn't know what they were walking into, but I was amazed how much they got into it, and they really started to embody and care and feel responsibility about other people's words. And here you can see it happening. I have a video here, but I don't think it's going to work, so I can play it at the end. But I'll just read you some of the responses so you can get a sense of, we've cataloged all of these and counted them, so they're really amazing responses. I'm voting here because my life matters, my family matters, and my community matters. I'm voting here, I'll skip the ones that are cursing. I'm voting here because our options suck. I'm voting here because I don't feel represented in this national election. I'm voting here because I want to give my opinion, I want to be considered, I want to be acknowledged. I'm voting here because I'm told that a protest vote is a selfish vote. I'm voting here because I don't want Trump to win, and Black Lives Matter. I'm voting here because the world needs a change. So what was interesting when people were doing this is that people would gather down on the street below and just sort of clap and try, and didn't know the context of what was happening, but somehow there were all these communities being built and all this interesting interaction, and everybody sort of felt these connections that you felt like there was a strong need for those during this time, and still is, I would say. So also on view at the same time right now is Aram's, as I mentioned, she's a fiber artist, and this was really her main project until we worked with her on this voting station. So these are U.S. citizenship test samplers, and the samplers are outcomes of workshops which Cifuentes had organized with other non-citizens to study the questions on the naturalization test through sewing. So each of the samplers are sewed for, actually I think it went up recently in the past 3 months to, I think it's $720, which is the cost of the U.S. naturalization application. And once people would finish their sampler, they would use the money to take the exam, and it raises questions about worthiness and who are worthy to be a citizen. So we hung these. We exhibited them on the second floor and also the first floor, kind of throughout the museum, because our historic house is not ADA accessible in that building. But you can see the names at the top of the creators, the age and the year that they made them. So probably a lot of these people are not citizens. I mean, there were people really young and really old, and they would pick one question of the 100 questions that are available and embroider it, and then could decorate it however they wanted to. And some of the decorations are just beautiful and amazing, and also some of the questions, as you know, are ridiculous, and a lot of people in this room probably would not pass the test. So, like one of the decorations I love is the one on the right. What does the president's cabinet do? And then it has a picture of a cabinet, which is great. So we took down historic house paintings that were on this wall that had been up there for over a decade, and we were a little worried that people were going to miss them. But it was seamless. People were really excited about this re-energizing the space, really responded to it. You'll see what you see here. You'll see a lot of people constantly clustering around these samplers and reading them and wondering about them. What I don't have in this picture, unfortunately, is Aram, the lead artist sampler. She has a long banner that she's still working on of all 100 questions. And so we attached it to the wall, and it sort of flows over, and she would come in and work on it as well. So it was sort of an active space. And then we had, in addition to the county days, we had these series of sewing workshops, which were just, they always sold out. They were free. Everything we do is free, but it was amazing how many people would sign up for these. The Aram told us that she usually has a hard time recruiting people because, you're trying to get people who are not non-citizens, who are not citizens and may want to not draw attention to their status. But we had so many more than we could even accommodate. It was really incredible. And what would happen at these sampler workshops, they would morph into mini discussions addressing immigrants' rights, labor politics, and everyday concerns of intergenerational and multi-ethnic people. So you can imagine when the immigration ban emerged, what the conversation was like. Of course, we didn't see that coming, but there was enough to pay attention to in anticipation of all of this to make these interventions and also to connect it to our history. So I mentioned that there were portable stations all over, and they would also send us photos back, which was really exciting, of these stations. So this one actually has a line to the official and unofficial voting station. And again, people can be eligible voters or ineligible voters. We don't know. But I also love that so many children were voting, because you never think about children not having the right to vote. All different kinds of voting stations around the country. This is one of my favorites. I just wanted to give you a sense of the collaborators. So all of this culminated into November 8th, Election Day, which, there's no spoiler alert, I guess. But we had always anticipated that no matter who won, we were going to work with this artist, one of Aram's collaborators, Yvette Mayorga on the left, and we were going to build a piñata wall and break it down on Election Day. And it's full of candy. So through that weekend, we worked with one of our partners, Free Street Theater, which is a social justice youth theater, and then people were coming in and out and helping to make papier-mâché boxes for this wall, and then day of, for several hours, people were coming to make it. And the art making, the collective making, was really a wonderful way for people to work out and connect with one another and counteract some of their anxieties. It was really fun. I just love this picture of the two artists just having a great time. We had a DJ, of course we always have food. We were collecting all of the ballots. In total, we received probably about 2,000 ballots from all the different sites. And so a lot of them we were counting that day. We were in our courtyard. People were making bricks, yelling out, "I'm voting here because," counting ballots, a lot of activity up to the election results. And I don't think these were our final numbers, but I just want to give you the sense of the organic tallying we were doing. We kept very detailed Excel sheets, but Hillary did win in the official, unofficial voting tally, but I don't think those are our final numbers, but we had a chalkboard. We do have a chalkboard with the final numbers. Again, no matter who won, we had always intended to keep the exhibition going, not end it at the election, but keep it through, at least through inauguration, and maybe through the State of the Union address, because we knew whoever won, there was going to be a contested feeling about it. So what we decided to do well in advance is that after November 8th, we would transform the stations into letter writing stations, in particular to the Chicago mayor and to the whoever the president-elect was going to be. And so we did do that. And again, just like the ballots, we're getting all of these incredible personal petitions, and some of them are so poetic, and what's on people's minds, what they care about, what they're pleading for, all different ages and backgrounds, people concerned about the dismantling of rights, and what to do. And people are really taking the time to do this as well. Sexual assault. There's just so many issues, and we have tons of these. All of these are going to be sent at the close of the exhibition to the appropriate recipients. One of the other things that we had always planned to do, we had a lot of public programming around this exhibition, were the protest banner making workshops. And they were going to be timed with inauguration. If you remember back to what was happening around then, there just happened to be a lot of protests happening that week, including the Women's March in DC. So this was incredibly popular. We could have done this for 3 days and it would have been packed. We did a protest banner making workshop for 8 hours, probably 9 hours, and we had over 100 people coming in, multi-generation, making these banners to take with them to whatever protests were happening that week. And eventually, or somewhere in the middle of this, Aram is now a resident at the Chicago Cultural Center, where she's doing a protest banner lending library because the demand was so great. And Whole House used to have an art lending library, where she got the initial idea. It's been very, very popular. Okay. So those are two contemporary exhibitions you wouldn't necessarily associate with a historic house museum. The last example I wanted to talk about is this ongoing project that's directly connected to the university. The others are too, but called Making the West Side Community Conversations on Neighborhood Change. So the museum, while it's been known for its robust public programming and social change focus, it's physically and philosophically separated from the West Side. Since it became part of the University of Illinois Chicago in the 1960s, early 1960s. And so in response, we've been trying to use neighborhood history to help West Side communities, partners, contextualize and address contemporary issues, which there are many. So we put in a grant which we received from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We were one of 21 recipients nationally awarded, and the only museum, which is sort of interesting when you think about roles of museums. And building on the tradition of whole house settlement work for the common good, this initiative, which was always intended to be ongoing, allows the museum for the first time to deeply investigate our own historic role in neighborhood change. We were once a neighborhood institution, and it's almost like now where we're situated, it's hard to see from the images, we don't have a neighborhood, we're on the Near West Side. So this is a project asking the question, how do we become good neighbors? And if you know anything about Chicago, it's one of the most segregated cities in the country. The neighborhoods are amazing, but they're also very, very segregated. So people call it a city of neighborhoods. So we wanted to put neighborhood history in conversation with neighborhood change. And the way that we did it was to anchor it in 2 critical decades of change that we were a part of, that are touchstones into pressing questions facing Chicago's West Side neighborhoods. So in the beginning years of Whole House settlement, this is the first decade, the social reformers conducted an unprecedented sociological neighborhood study where they collected survey data and used it to affect social change, and that was the intention. The resulting Whole House Maps and Papers project offered an important set of published essays and maps focused on understanding the makeup of the neighborhood. And then the second decade, which I'll talk about in a little bit, were the final years of Whole House from 1954 to 1963, which saw the destruction of Whole House settlement to make way for the University of Illinois of Chicago, which we're now a part of, as well as the demolition of many public housing projects. In addition, local West Side communities were displaced as part of urban renewal, and local and federal discriminatory housing policies which created ethnic and racial disparity. So both eras of change have profoundly influenced the major issues facing the West Side today, and yet there are few forums to connect these histories to our contemporary moment. These maps that you're looking at, there's a nationality map and a wage map, were inspired by Charles Booth's Maps of London that documented urban poverty. The project was conducted in conjunction with a larger federal study called A Special Investigation of the Slums of the Great Cities, which explored several major urban areas across the country. And because the women of Whole House already had this phenomenal relationship with the neighborhood, again, anticipating these things helps a lot. They were asked to do the Chicago study, which is great, and they wanted to do it as a way to combat the stereotypes of the neighborhood. They knew their neighbors. So to that end, Whole House residents and government schedule men went door to door to the Whole House neighborhood and asked residents questions about their nationality, wages, living conditions, family life, and working conditions. And these surveys were the basis for the book Whole House Maps and Papers, which included these beautiful color-coded maps. They worked with an artist, outlining the ethnicities and family wages of the neighborhood residents, as well as several essays that spoke directly to the conditions of different ethnic groups living on the West Side. And this text would become foundational in the emerging discipline of sociology. It was unique in that it was a group of self-trained women who analyzed and published the data. Additionally, it inspired subsequent studies, including W.E.B. Du Bois' sociological investigation of Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Negro. The neighborhoods of the West Side transformed many times over the 20th century as new migrants arrived and housing policies reinforced neighborhood segregation and wealth accumulation. While some ethnic groups achieved upward mobility, others were displaced and further oppressed racially and economically. No decade was more influential in creating the West Side as we understand it today than the late 1950s and early 1960s. So I'm going to move to the next era. Those are our 2 remaining houses. You can see all the empty space. Those would have been the other 11 buildings. These years saw major urban transformation across the country. It was in this decade that the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC, was built, and the Dan Ryan Expressway, now a major throughway, cut through the Near West Side to create a north-south corridor. These large-scale infrastructural changes, as well as many local and federal public policies, had a dramatic effect on the West Side's populations and community institutions. And when I came to Whole House, I was struck by 2 things. One, there was something called the West Side, because I had only heard mostly about the North Side and the South Side. And the West Side was in trouble in a lot of places, but not being talked about. So I was really, someone who works a lot on visibility and invisible histories, really compelled to look at our own history, being part of what's called the Near West Side and how we're involved with that. And the other thing that I was struck by is that the university that we're part of destroyed us. A lot of people would come to the museum and they still remember that and it was on their minds and don't feel very good about that because their families were displaced with this change. And in the museum currently, all we have is a very small panel above one fireplace that talks about that change. So I was sort of like, we have to talk about this. So I wasn't sure what kind of can of worms it would open, and I think that's the benefit of being an outsider. You can sort of take that chance a little bit more, but I was ready to accept whatever responsibility because it happened, so we needed to talk about it. So let's see. Hull House itself was the centerpiece of the Near West Side for almost a century, controversially demolished in 1961 in conjunction with the construction of UIC. Only 2 buildings were saved out of more than 13 buildings that made up Hull House at its height. And these buildings are now the location of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum. If not for the activism and direct protest by local West Side communities, many of whom were descendants of the original Hull House settlement, these remaining 2 buildings would not be standing. And that's Florence Scala, who led the struggle. People were protesting, putting their bodies on the line to block the demolition. All sorts of communities were involved with fighting this. It went all the way, it was a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, was kicked down. They lost, it was seized by eminent domain, and it was demolished, but the 2 buildings were kept up as a compromise. And I'm making a very long, complicated story, very short for the time. So urban historians point to these as pivotal years in the formation of the contemporary American city and look to policies created at this time during the 1950s, 60s as structural causes for urban poverty, racial segregation, and housing insecurity. Historically, the west side of Chicago is a space of disparate neighborhoods, largely segregated by economic and racial difference. The Hull House neighborhood in the 1890s included immigrants from across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, with the largest populations from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italian, Jewish, Polish, Russian, Chinese, Turkish, Bohemian, and many other nationalities of people lived within several blocks of the settlement in 1891. In the 1910s and 20s, Hull House neighborhood began to receive Mexican immigrants following the Mexican Revolution and African American migrants from the U.S. South. And I think that Chicago is still the second largest Mexican population outside of Los Angeles, I believe. Today's West Side is also home to a diverse range of racial and ethnic groups with markedly different historical and social formations. Today's West Side is starkly segregated, also representing sizable wealth, housing, employment, education, and racial disparities. In addition, gentrification threatens to continue to creep west and displace communities and cherished memories. The rapid neighborhood change occurs with little cross-neighborhood interracial discussion, with little grounding in West Side history. So I thought, well, why shouldn't we help broker that discussion? So we created this Making the West Side project, and of course, the danger with these is that you'll leave somebody out. So we selected as partners other places like us, museums that represented both historical neighborhoods, but also contemporary neighborhoods. So the National Public Housing Museum, you cannot talk about neighborhood change in Chicago or any place without talking about housing, will open up in 2 years in Little Italy. The National Hellenic Museum is in Greektown, represents former Greektown, but also present-day Greektown, which is mostly retail, and down the street from Hull House. The National Museum of Mexican Art, which was originally a Czech neighborhood, and that's why it's called Pilsen, and is now primarily Mexican-American and rapidly gentrifying. And then on the west side, in North Lawndale, we have 2 partners. We could not find a museum for reasons related to the topic of this project, the history of disinvestment. So we picked our first cousin, a library, Frederick Douglass Library, and we're also working, it's not on there, we're also working with the Social Service Agency. North Lawndale is the neighborhood that Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about in his article in The Atlantic on reparations. He's talking about North Lawndale, the west side of Chicago, just to give you some reference. So it's been an interesting project. I can tell you a lot more about it, but I'll just sort of run through what's been happening. It's kicked off, well, I shouldn't say kicked off with an all-day forum, because before that we had to sort of work with the cultural partners, and we would meet monthly up to the forum. And that itself was like having mini community conversations, because a lot of people around the table had never talked across neighborhood or across cultural institution. So that was really interesting and also very challenging at times, but eyes on the prize. So we created this all-day public forum that was incredibly successful. We advertised it, and in like 48 hours it was filled up. We could only accommodate about 75 people in our space, and we had over 100 people there, and many more people signed up. So we know that there was a need, and we were speaking to something, and these were different panels that we created that tied people together across neighborhoods, in these under these special themes like racism, disinvestment, racist housing policies, redevelopment. The second panel focused a lot on the Near West Side and the university's role in demolishing the settlement and also transforming the neighborhood. The last one we talked about resilient neighborhoods with neighborhood associations and public health and cultural organizations, the role in education, which is a huge issue everywhere, but especially in Chicago with 50 schools closing recently, and a lot of them are on the west side. So this is sort of what the forum looked like. Standing room only. We had radio veterans moderating. It was really sort of an incredible day. We had people engaged to the end from all different sectors. So it was not only cross-neighborhood, it was cross-sector, which was interesting. Also, people had personal stories. So it was a very interesting mix of people, where at the end of the day, community residents who are from the West Side were saying, it was the first time I felt really proud to be from the West Side, because everybody was so engaged on a substantive level and interested in the West Side and what was happening and how it came to be. And it's just not talked about anywhere. There's not a lot of outlets. So it's really sort of disturbing when you think about the silences. The next day we had a half-day closed institute with just the cultural partners and the scholars and the presenters, and we kind of debriefed from what was happening, but again, experimental, organized it where we had qualitative and quantitative approaches presented about how to understand poor neighborhoods and how to interact with neighborhoods. So we had urban planners talking about demographics and statistics. I'm sure the cultural partners were sort of like, what are you doing? Then we also had oral historians talking about, Audrey Petty talking about her work about collecting stories from public housing residents. If you know anything about the public housing history in Chicago, a lot of the public housing has been torn down. So what remains are people's stories and memories, and that's been documented in high-rise stories from Audrey. So it was, again, a really powerful session, and the goal was to help the community partners create what were community conversations that were going to be happening all over the summer throughout the West Side that they had already been planning. So these are these conversations where we had storytelling. We did oral history workshops for people, realizing that they might not have access to that. We recorded everything we could. We also scanned and archived pieces that people brought in, photographs and from their home and pictures that they wanted to share. We did all sorts of experimental things. Some of these community conversations were open. Some were closed because people needed the privacy to talk. Some of them were really heated. This is BBF Family Services, one of our partners in North Lawndale. And we did an oral history workshop with the youth there who were amazing, who had never done oral history, and for 3 hours interviewed all of these people from the neighborhood, asking, really focusing on who left, who stayed, and who returned. And those interviewees were brought together, and they did this in this 3-hour public program that was pretty amazing, and really interesting folks. Again, standing room only. This was at the Public Housing Museum. I was moderating a storytelling workshop about memories about public housing. People would do mapping exercises, which are really interesting. A lot of interest in oral history and documenting your own history. And you think about the West Side too, you're really talking about decades and decades of not documenting this history. So we wanted to support self-determination and documenting your own history. And we found that people really were interested in that. You can see things that people brought from home that they cared about, that spoke to their neighborhood history. We worked at the public library with kids and used historic photographs and mapping exercises of the settlements. At one point in Chicago was a settlement leader. There were 15 settlements by the turn of the century in Chicago alone, and 400 total in the Northeast.
Sorry, this is a stupid question, especially from a born-and-bred Chicagoan. What do you mean when you say settlement?
Oh, the social settlement. So the settlements were these places that I was talking about at the beginning, places that were intentionally set up in what were considered the worst neighborhoods, usually close to laborers, factories, as a way to create social change, as a way to help improve people's lives. And it was sort of, like I was saying, blurring the public and private sphere. So there were actual physical places that people set up where people lived in the settlement and worked there. But then there were also lots of activities happening throughout the settlement for people to come in conjunction with their work as an alternative to work. So some people have compared them to communes, and I don't think that we have an equivalent for them. It was a certain moment where people were trying to grapple with industrialization and the ravages of industrialization and unregulated labor. So for the whole house settlement, a lot of people theorized that it was created to fight sweatshops, that the main priority was to advocate for labor rights. And that was a big part of the whole house settlement. So much of it was labor focused, for sure. But it was really institutions created, immersed in neighborhoods that were focused on improving those neighborhoods and working with the people to improve those neighborhoods. So these are some of our cultural partners. We all love each other now. I was doing an oral history workshop with them to take back to their places. We also ended in a teacher institute, a week-long teacher institute, worked with educators around the city who were interested in using West Side history or neighborhood history to think about neighborhood change in their lessons and their curriculum. And some of them were math teachers and science teachers. It was really interesting what they came up with. And we have all those lesson plans that they created. Everything that we recorded, videos, all of that stuff, is going into a website called Making the West Side that we're going to make available any day now, in 2 or 3 weeks, hopefully, as a resource for people to have access to this history, where there will be relatable essays, constantly populating the site about different issues happening on the West Side, history and contemporary. This is in the museum. This is where the samplers were. This is what used to be. These are the teachers and educators who were part of the week-long workshop.
Are you going to do that again, or was that a one-time?
It's so funny. Every time we do a piece of this and we're like ready to die from exhaustion, even with the forum, even before it was finished, people were like, are you going to do it again? So we are thinking about, we had an evaluator, so we learned a lot from doing this. And it was the kind of evaluation, the formative, where as you go along, you're also sort of feeding back into, okay, maybe we should do this. It was sort of a long year of experiment. So some of the things that emerged, that people were really interested in oral history, documenting their own histories. And people always say, oh, I'm tired of talking and too much talking, but people wanted more conversations and deeper conversations. So we have restarted the community conversations. I actually put some flyers on the back so you could see what's coming up next and some of the issues. And we're trying to focus on issues that came up through all of these different avenues and discussions that we hadn't yet focused on, or that we've learned that people wanted deeper. So we've got to also apply for more funding to think about the next phase. But we're learning from everyone about what kind of role we can play and how to best occupy that role. I think brokering those relationships as a West Side component is really helpful. We're conveniently located. But yeah, people are very excited about it. I'm pleased to say, because we had some moments with such contested history and issues. So those are 3 examples. We have so many more. I love images, but I thought maybe I'd leave you with a little text. So these are questions that we think about, and in designing our programs and our exhibitions and all that we do. And implied in here, you'll see some of our core values. You see assumptions we make about the direction we want to go in. But we're always asking them, and we're always revising our questions as well. Of course, these represent our priorities. Does the program connect to the legacy of Hull House? But we don't want to do that for the sake of just connecting to Hull House. There's a lot about Hull House and the history of the settlement that I think is really important, that we can learn from in thinking about the public sphere and the common good. And of course, engaging social justice issues is very important to us. Does the intervention connect past with present to social movements as well? And I'm on video, but we're a state institution, so we can't be partisan. So we're always in a tricky situation with the work that we do, which is always pushing the envelope. So we can't really lead direct actions and protests. So we are constantly figuring out how we can do that and how we can support those who do advocacy and direct action. And I'd really be interested in hearing feedback about your ideas about how you envision that happening at your own places or places that you've been to. We are really big on interdisciplinary thinking. Hull House was this interdisciplinary site. There's another initiative we have called Securing the Common Good I won't go into, but it's connecting humanities with non-humanities disciplines. So history with social workers and School of Nursing and all of that was represented in Hull House history. And we're really trying to get people out of their silos across neighborhoods, across sectors, across disciplines. So we've been in this strange role of kind of translating some of these. And of course, as I was saying earlier, we are perpetually focused on the marginalized, underrepresented, intersectional voices and different perspectives. We're constantly thinking about the vulnerable. And it's not that other people don't matter, but we know that by definition, the most vulnerable communities don't have these kind of resources to support them. And so we're really committed to the marginalized. Like I said, the settlement, Jane Addams has a famous quote about how the settlement, it needs to be nimble and flexible and always is an ongoing experiment. And we really take that to heart, where everything that we do is very experimental. I don't know that we get it right. Unlike a lot of people, I don't really think that you ever fail in this work. I think that it's always worth trying something, and you learn something from it. And so I think that's the most important goal, to keep learning and keep using what you learn to do better. Yes, authoritative voice. Everyone talks about shared authority, that we want to share authority, but it's much easier said than done, and so we're always trying to figure that out. It's really challenging to do that, especially when you're a university, you're an institution, you have an authority. So is it better to pretend that you don't have that authority, or to acknowledge the authority you have and use your role in certain ways? So we're constantly thinking about what that means, and I'm hoping to hear what you have to say about that as well. Does it align with the vision, priorities, and capacity of the museum? Of course, so some of the practical questions, too, are about resources and funding and things like that. And the last one is, we really try to think about doing things in a different way, not to just be cool, which we do like to be cool, but really because things don't seem to change when you keep doing them the same way. So, resisting conventions seems to work for us. It creates openings that aren't necessarily there for ideas and conversations. So we are constantly thinking about, is that courageous? Is that not courageous? One person's courage is not another person's courage necessarily. So thinking about how to take chances. I would say the staff is pretty great about, learning what the obstacles are, but not letting it stop us. It's not a reason that we don't do something, but we do sort of try to get informed about what's in our way. So I think that's it. So I'm happy to take questions and hear your comments and feedback. Thank you. Oh my God, that's a really good question. I'm an anthropologist. I studied anthropology, so I feel like I was minding my own business. No, I've always sort of my work, because my graduate research was on women dressmakers and textiles. So I was always sort of visually oriented and kind of dabbled in museums and worked in different ways. Definitely very focused on social issues and social justice issues, personally, intellectually, professionally, for many different reasons. So for me, museums and historic house museums, like I never thought I was going to end up in historic house museums, have been a vehicle to be able to facilitate some of those goals and practices towards making social change. So I think, it might not be a museum or a historic house, it might be something else. I think the real interest I have is history and its usefulness for today and its resonance, the relevancy. And that may look like museum work, but it may not look like museum work. For me, it's been looking like museum work and historic house museum work. But probably through anthropology, although I think I got into anthropology because I really was attracted to I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate and very interested in science as well, and I think I was attracted with anthropology to the ethnographic. So firsthand study, field work, and sort of really being there and what difference it makes being there and not being there. So especially with Whole House, that immersion model, the settlement is fascinating to me. What worked and what didn't work. So it's something I could talk about forever, but yes.
Really admire what you've done. It's really exciting. And I'm just trying to think what you've tried to do besides with community groups, with schools and kids, and helping them understand the legacy of settlement, the whole settlement movement.
Right, I was just talking about this earlier with Jessica. Before I got to Whole House, I actually imagined, because so much of the Whole House settlement history is about progressive education. So John Dewey, Maria Montessori, really taking chances with education, the Chicago lab schools, hands-on, experimental. And we interpret that in the museum. So we talk about, there's even a childhood section in the museum called The Invention of Childhood. The settlement workers actually advocated for the 8-hour workday, and we're trying to help working mothers through creating these daycare facilities, because also the children were, this was before child labor laws. So there's actually a sizable section of the museum that talks about children and history, and we get a lot of school groups, but we actually don't right now, and I don't know if this is typical of university museums, this is the first university museum I've worked with, that we don't do as much K-12 work that I think we could be doing considering the history. So right now we have kind of a whole new education team that's focused on K-12 and thinking about school partnerships in the schools, but also different sort of educational programming in the museum related, and also making the museum, I have one educator, she keeps talking about cushions, but making the museum more kid-friendly and education-friendly. Right now it's really, I would say, an adult museum. Even though we get a lot of kids in school groups, but we don't really have specialized programming. And I'd like to see what we can do with that, because our topics are quite heavy. And recently we had a 2-year-long program called Cities of Peace. That was an exchange between Cambodian youth and youth in Chicago who were dealing, addressing issues of state violence and interpersonal violence in conjunction with the 40th year anniversary of the Khmer Rouge genocide. So, and then one of the groups we were working with is a group in Chicago who had gone to The Hague. They're called We Charge Genocide, to petition that the state violence and police violence in Chicago be considered a human rights issue. And so, We Charge Genocide, and we don't do very light things. So thinking about that with K-12, I think would be a great challenge and such a good opportunity. And everyone on staff right now is sort of oriented towards that. So that's something that we hope will develop more. I was a little surprised that it hadn't happened as much before, but I see why, because of the material. So we're actually working on it. I don't know, do you have some suggestions?
We can talk more later.
Okay, good. Anybody has suggestions, we're open to that.
So how are you structurally attached to the museum, to the university? I know you're part of it, but are you attached to a school or a department, or are you a freestanding institution within the...
That's such a good question. So we are part of the College of Architecture, Design, and the Arts.
Okay.
Yes, I know, it's an odd thing, but somehow, I guess because we're a museum, it works. It wasn't always that way. From what I understand, because of Hull House's interdisciplinary nature, it sounds like in the early, I've been trying to reconstruct this history, in the early 1960s when the two buildings were being restored, Hull House was actually under facilities. And then it moved to, I think, to liberal arts, and the School of Social Work is named after Jane Addams School of Social Work, so I think it was under the School of Social Work for a year or two. I'm not sure about all the politics, probably mostly politics of why and funding. We've changed around, so now we're in the art college, which works out well in some ways because our museum and exhibition studies program is in the art college under art history right now, and then also because we work a lot with artists and contemporary artists, so definitely overlap. We tend to work a lot more with entities outside the college, which we're trying to think about more because we have the theater school in our college, and there was a robust theater program at Hull House. So we're working to have more relationships beyond art history and museum studies in the college, but we work with, there's the Centers of Cultural Understanding, they call them on campus, the Latino Cultural Center, the African American Cultural Center, Gender and Women's Studies. There's all these other entities that we work a lot with as well that are outside of the college. So we do have a home, but the university uses us in their marketing materials as sort of like a treasure for everyone, for the campus. So it's something that's constantly being rethought, I think, and reassessed. And I think it's because of the special nature of Hull House, that we don't quite fit anywhere. And that's okay for us. I think that we have like over 100 community partners and work with activists, and so in some ways we keep the university connected to the communities or different communities, and so we just want to keep doing that however we do it. So it's I think we're okay with where we are. We work with the dean of the art college a lot, who's extremely supportive. When I was doing the Making the West Side thing, he's fairly new too, just a couple of years on me. So I told him that I was going to do this project because I felt like I had to give him a warning because I didn't know what would happen and that we were going to talk about this. And he was just right away saying, that's great, do it, full support, which is fantastic. Knowing that there might be issues. So I really appreciated that. So it works. But I think under your question is, where do you fit in?
Yeah.
And we don't fit into any one place. We don't. Yes.
Jennifer, how do you, if you integrate students into, I know that it's a public school system, so I actually don't know what the size of the undergraduate and graduate populations is.
I think it's like 23,000, maybe 28,000.
To provide?
No, undergraduate.
Undergraduate.
Yeah.
And is there a way that you involve undergrads and classes in the work of Hull House?
Yeah, it's been very uneven, so we're trying to think again of everything in a more sustainable, systematic way. So because Hull House is very responsive to contemporary issues, they have this thing when I first arrived called guerrilla programming, which is about being responsive, which is really exciting, really immediate and important. But then I think what was weaker was these sort of more systematic, long-term relationships. And how we engage students is one of them. So different points we had undergraduates working as docents, paid docents, but that was heartbreaking to me because every semester we would lose people and we'd have to start over again with the training and the tours. And so we've been trying to experiment with better models where we aren't using students and undergraduates and graduates as essential staff and really try to enhance mutual learning. So we sponsor 2 graduate students pretty much almost every semester, one from art history and one from the graduate program in museum studies, and they're great. They do research and they help, they usually have a bent towards museums and the visuals, so they've been a great addition. And then we have history interns for the first time since last year who are there's going to be a class formalized where history students receive credit for their internships, and so we helped pilot that last year through Making the West Side, and that's also been great. I'm trying to think of what else.
teach?
Oh, right, that. The graduate students, as well, and that's been great. We have a commitment to teach one of the core courses in the Museum and Exhibition Studies program, and because we're the only collecting institution, I'm teaching the collections course. So that's been great because we can actually build upon that and involve students in the museum in deeper ways, which we did last year. We focused on neighborhood collections, and they were able to have a lot of hands-on interaction and research with some of our specific collections, which was really helpful to us, but also they enjoyed it, which was fantastic. So we're still figuring that out and thinking about more long-term programs. Right now it's sort of in and out, and we'll probably be proposing an undergraduate course related to the common good and whole house settlement. Right now there's no course taught on this, which is amazing. So that's connected to our Securing the Common Good program.
Along the lines of guerrilla programming versus long-term programs, how do you decide what to take on at Whole House?
It's so hard. This is something we're still figuring out. It's really, really hard because you don't want to be just, especially being Whole House, you don't want to be, your head in the clouds doing something else when there's a crisis happening. And, even now there's something going on, and while I'm here, and you're just you have to be responsive and think, do we need to teach? And, so we're just trying to think about different ways of balancing. One of the things that I've been aware of, and I think the staff is becoming more and more aware of, there's certain issues and social issues that are not going away anytime soon. And so, the voting station, the incarceration, those are things that we're anticipating, thinking about walls, thinking about, and they turned out to be very timely. I think that's because there's a lot happening that is going to take a long time or a longer time to resolve. So it's really about kind of tapping into that in advance, and also committing to partners to certain issues. In Chicago, mass incarceration and violence, of course, is a big issue, and there's a lot of activism in Chicago, which is really inspiring, especially coming from the youth. There's, every Tuesday night there's in downtown they have Resist Trump Tuesdays, so they do protesting every Tuesday. There's this constant activism, and so there's a really incredible energy there that helps us know fairly, with some ease, what people are interested in, and so we try to tap into that. But the trick is figuring out our role and what we can do short-term versus long-term. So it's ongoing discussions among the staff about what we can take on and what we can handle as a museum. A lot of it has to do with discussions and conversations, I would say, and education.
So I have a question. I've seen my colleague about technology. So I know that
from being at Hull House that there are a lot of things there that are beautifully low tech, and then there are things there that are seriously high tech, right?
What are the high-tech things?
Well, I'm thinking about that prison exhibit that had the whole screen. You know, you were talking about screen interactions and that kind of thing. And so I'm curious how you all decide about those kinds of things, you know, using technology or using, you know, really more, I don't think that those can both be hands-on, right? But how you make some choices about that. That's really
Our technology is not all that advanced. You know, our AV is archaic, and we have a lot of programs, so it's really challenging. But I think that the staff is pretty agreed on not overdoing it, and really the main goal is to focus on the content and the learning, and you know the inspiration. And so there's a point where the technology becomes distracting. So we're all okay with fairly low tech engagement, but there are, you know, I'm not anti-technology at all, because I think there's great opportunities and advancements that can help us to think about these connections between history and social justice, present day issues very easily that we haven't employed. But I think, you know, in spaces like ours, which are not very large, you don't really want to overdo it. I think, you know, technology is computer generated and digital products, but it's also a photograph. And so we haven't used a lot. We have 3,000 photographs of the Hull House settlement. We haven't used a lot in the exhibit. So thinking about how to present photographs and images, you know, that some technology can work really well. But I think you don't want to be distracting from what's happening. And it can be really distracting where you have to worry how to do this. I mean, like our disco exhibit was very low tech with curtains, and you know, we had we have a video screen up now showing some of the portable stations, but it's not, you know, I think we actually could experiment with a little bit more tech in our space.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you all.
So there's probably still some food. Yes. We want to encourage you. We don't want to take that home. We want you to eat that. And there's, as Jennifer said, there's a lot of materials on the back table as well.
Oh, which is
Really? It's so inspiring. I want to bring here.
Doing out there,
I'll take care of this. I'll take care of this. You talk to people.
and mine and part of it's yours.
I know. I got it.
I'm a history major, and I'm actually moving to New York. I'm moving to work